Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for an AI for webinar series show. We are so excited to have you all here today. And today we'll be discussing how governments are applying AI. Before we jump in, I have one quick housekeeping item. If you can please put all of your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat, that makes it easier for us to organize your questions so that we can get to as many as possible. So please make sure to use that Q&A box when submitting your questions. Other than that, I'd like to go ahead and bring our panelists to the virtual stage so that we can get started with this incredible content we have planned for you today. I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dan, our moderator for today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrika. Hello, thank you so much for joining. To all who are watching this, my name is Daniel Lackman. I lead content for the AI4 community events. And I am so excited to have four absolutely outstanding guests here today for the session. And so without any further ado, I will have them introduce themselves and talk just with a couple sentences about the sort of work that they do and what their role is. So I will have Tony kick it off. Tony, who are you and why are you on a government webinar for AI?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Hu, data scientist and technical program manager at the FBI. I started with the Bureau more than 10 years ago and was one of the first employees here, appointed to the data scientist job series. So I've had the fun opportunity to provide AI support to a number of investigative programs, from counterterrorism to fraud to civil rights, all sorts of stuff. I also lead a software team that builds data products that are in use in field offices around the country. So very excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tony. Karen, would you mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about some of the work that you do and formerly did?
Sure, Dan, I'm happy to be here as well. I am Karen Evans. I am the former DHS Chief Information Officer. And prior to that, I was also the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response. I'm so used to using government acronyms as CSER. And what we worked on and what I'm excited to talk a little bit about was how we were using AI at the Department of Homeland Security, because the Chief Data Officer was underneath my shop and we were setting that up. And also how we were doing work with the national labs as it relates to machine learning and artificial intelligence and securing the grid with renewable energy sources as it relates to cybersecurity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen. Jerry, would you like to take it away with a self-introduction?
Sure thing. Thank you, Dan. I'm so excited to be here with my fellow co-panelists. My name is Jerry Ma, and I serve as the Director of Emerging Technology at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So as America's innovation agency, we promote the development and commercialization of AI, machine learning, and other innovative technologies through issuing patents, registering trademarks, and overall maintaining an intellectual property system supportive of those at the bleeding edge of innovation. So I'm very much looking forward to learning from and exchanging notes with my fellow co-panelists, and very excited to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerry. And last but certainly not least, David, would you like to give a self-introduction to the crowd?
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Fletcher. I've been the Chief Technology Officer for the state of Utah for the last 16 years, I guess, overseeing digital government initiatives and innovation and technical architecture, things like that. Most recently, we've put together in the last about 2018, I believe, an AI Center of Excellence. So we've been focused on implementing a wide variety of AI initiatives across the state of Utah.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Patrika, if you wouldn't mind, why don't we jump into the first question? Okay, great. The first question is, how much adoption of AI have you seen for government use cases? And exactly how widespread is this technology right now? And so anyone can jump in and start with this. But basically, this question is about the inception of AI programs and, the prevalence of AI use cases around town. And if anyone would like to jump in, go ahead. If not, I'm happy to pick somebody.
What I see is that there's been a lot of growth in AI use cases, especially, I mean, each year the speed and the pace picks up. We started, 2014, Amazon came out with their Amazon Echo device, and we created some applications for that, where it uses voice recognition applications, and that caught the attention of a lot of people, how responsive that device was. And we developed interactive applications for taking driver's license tests and finding phishing spots. And it was easy to do when you had a lot of good data. And since then, it's really taken off. We started speaking with our peers at NASCIO, the National Association of State CIOs, and 3 years ago they came out with a document that we worked with them on AI use cases across states, and so it became really important this past year for COVID. I mean, simple applications like chatbots were obviously very large, but an important one for us was machine learning for fraud detection, and we were glad we had that in place prior to the distribution of all these unemployment funds, because we were able to avoid a lot of the headaches that some of the other states had with fraudulent claims. But it's grown a lot, and it will continue to grow, and the pace will pick up. It's now in the top 10 in terms of importance for state government.
Gotcha. Thank you, David. Karen, you want to weigh in on this? I actually have a note here that you oversaw the largest civilian IT portfolio in the federal government when you were the CIO of DHS. I'm curious on your perspective on this question.
So I would echo a lot of what David said, but I would say that COVID really accelerated the ability for us to have those use cases that you're asking about. So one in particular that we were working on when I was at DHS was really predictive analysis based on contact tracing data. So as our employees would get exposed, we knew that the vaccination was going to become available. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure that our leadership would have is, okay, where is the distribution of the vaccination? That takes into consideration data from VA. Then what is happening within the community coming from our own employees? So that's our own data sources. And then marrying it up with data sources from Health and Human Services, because we really wanted to be able to, in essence, have like a placemat so that they could say, hey, this is what's happening within DHS to our current workforce. And this is where we're going to have to be able to do some distribution or redistribute our workforce, or where we see the hot spots. And so that's what we were using it for. And the team was really working on that, getting those things up and running and being able to transition that into the next administration.
Very, very interesting. Jerry or Tony, would either of you like to jump in? Feel free to just jump in whenever you like also with any of this.
Sure thing. So I think I also echo both Karen and David's points. There's been so much proliferation of AI technologies, particularly, just in the past year and a half. But I'd take a bit of a contrarian view when we zoom out, to 35,000 feet. If you take a look at the AI deployed versus the potential AI that could be deployed in the government, we're still in the very, very early stages of AI adoption, certainly within the USPTO, and I think it's safe to say across the entire federal government. And I think for now, this is really for good reason. AI is a technology for which we currently have much higher visibility into the benefits than the risks. So, the benefits we don't need to discuss here. Suffice to say, from protein folding to music composition to playing board games, we've seen amazing demonstrations of AI's power and potential by academia and media industry. But we have a very limited understanding of the risks of AI comparatively. And the little we do know is pretty scary. So for example, you can add a bunch of imperceptible noise to a picture to fool an image recognition model into thinking a person is a car or a cat or what have you. You can take one of these big AI language models that's all the rage these days and very easily elicit racist speech from them. You can even slap a shiny sticker onto a stop sign outside to trick a self-driving car AI model into ignoring that stop sign. And of course, there's a whole class of risks that don't involve bad actors at all. Just regular people using state-of-the-art run-the-mill AI models that can produce unintended or biased results. So I think the bottom line is that government agencies, including the USPTO, are starting to deploy AI as a tool, but almost always in contexts that somewhat de-risk such deployments from these concerns I just mentioned. So things like logistics, operations, automation, and optimization, annotating documents and getting them to the right place, helping human experts make sense of complex, unstructured information, anomaly detection for, I think, as David said before, fraud prevention and cybersecurity, customer service, and so on. So things for which we can really, concretely understand and manage the risk-benefit trade-offs.
Yeah, so I want to build on kind of Jerry's point about that AI, even though it has, you could in some sense say it has pretty long history. Neural nets were around in the 50s. The FBI has actually been using some aspects of AI, such as voice and facial recognition, for decades up to now, but always within carefully applied legal guidelines. And that kind of gets to Jerry's point about, there's all these risks. It's not just a matter of, does the technology do like a particular thing in a technical context, but then how do we work that into the context of how our organizations operate? And so, for example, the FBI also frequently collaborates with private sector and academia to understand the state of the art in AI and kind of where these technologies are headed. In fact, we have an entire office of private sector devoted to facilitating just these kinds of strategic relationships. And so in that sense, you could say adoption of AI technology is quite widespread, but again, it comes back to that we're very careful about having this fit in our context of our legal guidelines and frameworks.
Excellent. Yeah, so interesting to hear all of your perspectives. So, I mean, it seems like everyone has a healthy appreciation for AI's prevalence in government, but it seems like a lot of people are saying that, there's a lot of room to work with still. I'd be curious to follow up on this question. I mean, what do you think is the confluence of factors that are impacting the increase in the use of AI, but that so far have limited its use cases into what it sounds like, Jerry said would be, true widespread AI use case? What are the confluence of factors that are impacting, its adoption at the pace it's at?
So let me jump in. One of the jobs that I didn't mention that I had previously was what is now called, and people would know, is the federal CIO job, Federal Chief Information Officer's job at the Executive Office of the President at Office of Management and Budget. And so what you're really asking, Dan, is one of the recognitions of the federal government is we're probably the largest data holder, globally, based on all the information that is collected from all the different federal agencies. And with that, and I think Jerry and Tony have clearly articulated that, is okay, there's a lot of potential from the data that we have, but there's a lot of unintended consequences associated with that. So we have a lot of statutory responsibilities, like from the Privacy Act. And one of my jobs was the eGov Act gave me 42 new statutory responsibilities all about outreach, but I also had to balance privacy on top of that, right? And cybersecurity. And so what we're talking about is technology has evolved to a point where there's so much promise. We are a large data source, and we have to maintain the integrity of the data and the results that it returns back to the American people within a legal structure. And that's why you probably don't see, or the way that people look at the government as a whole, a wide deployment of the technology as fast as it could go, because I think people might get a little bummed out if the FBI was really using facial recognition across all the states and identifying a bunch of people. I mean, we might end up in court saying that's a huge violation of the Privacy Act. And did they get their national security letter? And did they get the right, legal authorizations to be able to use that? Can we do it? Absolutely. Should we do it? That's what needs to be discussed by society.
Definitely. Anyone else have a perspective on that question before we jump to the next topic?
I think, to that whole question, I think we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to use AI increasingly because of the volume of data that we have to deal with. We just need to make sure that we do it right and that we identify the parameters around which we operate. And I mean, if you just look at something like cybersecurity, we can't keep up without AI. We can't keep up without the ability to sift through the billions of potential attacks that are levied at our government networks, whether it's state or federal, without some kind of artificial intelligence capability. And as we've moved as a country into more open data as well, and open data is being used, if not by the government, by our customers, by businesses and citizens, and it presents huge opportunities. We also have to look at where we stand in relationship to potential adversaries, and we need to be prepared for that, and we need to be able to leverage this technology for a lot of good things, as well as for security, not just cybersecurity, but other kinds of security in a global stage where there are threats that exist. So it's an imperative that we come to grips with AI as a technology. And it's not just a technology, it's many technologies, right? And some have greater risk than others. So we need to have those discussions, but we also need to be ready to move forward fairly aggressively, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Patricia, let's jump to the next question. Okay, so to dive into specific use cases a bit more for the audience. So the question is, where are you currently seeing AI delivering value throughout the government? Please offer as many detailed examples as possible, whether that be one really detailed one or just, a few. And I was actually thinking, David, if it's okay with you, I'd love to start with you because you did something really interesting, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but you created the first AI Center of Excellence at the state level in government, which I think is really notable. And so would you like to kick off this question?
Yeah, we're about 3 years into our AI Center of Excellence. And one of the first things we did the first year, I think we developed 12 initiatives in our first year. And one of those was to create a database of use cases. And there's a lot of them. And we have a pretty broad participation in our AI Center of Excellence. I thought that was important because of the potential in all of the different areas of state government. One is clearly in transportation, where we've got a large connected autonomous vehicle initiative where we're developing the infrastructure to be able to work more effectively with autonomous vehicles as they're developing. And we have autonomous vehicles today at multiple levels of autonomy. So that's a large one for us, and we have several members of our team that are in that area. We also, I mentioned earlier, machine learning for unemployment fraud detection. There are other kinds of fraud detection. Our insurance department uses it. Even in healthcare. Another area that was an interesting one for us was in agriculture, and there are actually lots of applications in agriculture, but we have a small branding inspection group that inspects brands in cattle and other kinds of livestock. And they had a branding book that has about 70,000 different brands that are used across the state. And every time someone would request a new brand, they had to go through this book and try to carefully match up and see if what brands were close to that. And so they've automated that process with image recognition, and it takes seconds now instead of days to process new brand requests. If someone identifies a stray cattle, They can quickly identify the owner by using AI image recognition-based matching. So it has lots of uses. It saved our agriculture department a lot of time. And, I could go on with lots of applications. My neighbor, actually, this is not a government one, but it's related to Jerry. He's a patent attorney, and he's developed a machine learning going against Jerry's database of patents to facilitate his job, and it really helps the work of those patent attorneys to identify, what kinds of innovations and patent requests they can support based on what's already out there, because it's a huge database. So wherever you have huge amounts of data, and where we've had a lot of bureaucratic processes in the past, we're able to automate those and streamline them. And so that's really one of my main interests is with citizen digital government. And one of the things we do is we use sentiment analysis from one of the cloud providers to sift through the database of our feedback database. We get lots of feedback from citizens from our online services, and we're able to quickly identify what are the trends and what are the main issues for our citizens. And we also use Salesforce Einstein to analyze our constituent database for the Governor Office of Constituent Services. And he can quickly identify if there are trends in different parts of the state. So when he goes to speak to different areas, what are the big issues in those areas of the state? And so there's just really hundreds of uses for state government. Those are a few that where we've implemented solutions, but there are many more.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective. The case of the missing cattle I find particularly interesting. Yeah, so Jerry, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I feel like I have to jump in after that patent reference. So I think, that story, David, the story that you shared was just emblematic of one of the chief ways that AI delivers value in the government, despite the government not necessarily building the AI itself, right? So it's the whole open data story. We, the government, we, the agency, we, the state, are going to give this data to the public. We're going to make it machine readable. We're going to well document it. And then you, the citizens, or you, private industry, go build whatever is most useful for you. AI solutions, non-AI solutions, any which way, share what you've built, commercialize what you've built. Awesome. That's really how a lot of value add from the government in the AI sector ultimately comes, not by the government, building its own AI models necessarily, but simply by that act of putting data out in the open, making it machine readable, making it easily parsable, and then letting anyone do, whatever they want with it, and trusting that they'll build cool things. But getting back to the topic of how governments actually use AI, internally, I think out of all federal government agencies, at least, the USPTO is probably among the most dependent on human capital. So this is absolutely crucial given the hybrid technical and legal nature of our work, and we employ almost 10,000 highly trained scientists, engineers, and attorneys as case examiners to serve our customers and the innovation community. So at the USPTO, the vast majority of our AI efforts are thus targeted toward what we think of as giving superpowers to our examiners. So human judgment is and will remain the key to how we do things at the USPTO. So in that sense, we want to free up more of our experts' time to apply that judgment and human expertise, and deal with the other sort of less consequential things on the side. So I'll give two examples of how we do so. First, we need to get cases to the right people. So for example, it'd be a huge waste of time for everyone involved if we sent an application for a new rocking chair to an examiner whose expertise is in electronics. Fortunately, we don't really encounter, such ridiculous cases of misrouting, but there are more nuanced cases that sometimes pop up. Someone who's a world expert in microprocessors for mobile phones may not be all that equipped to adjudicate cases about random access memory, despite these both being, computer, semiconductor technologies. And what happens is that either the expert attempts to examine the case anyways and maybe isn't super effective, Or alternatively, the expert flags the case and then there's this game of ping pong back and forth for that case to be rerouted to a better suited expert. So AI can help us, and in fact is helping us in reducing these sort of errors and getting cases to the right folks. So second, when we finally get the case to the right folks, they need to be able to quickly retrieve the right resources to examine that case. So on the patent side of the house, this requires knowing the state of what we call the relevant prior art, because you can only get a patent if you did something that hasn't already been done before. Now think about the evolution of this task over the years. 2 centuries ago, we had Thomas Jefferson in his capacity as Secretary of State literally examine applications himself with the aid of his personal library. And this was, the late 1700s. Now fast forward to 2021, and there's just a bit more, a few million more books, magazines, scientific papers, technical white papers, blog posts, and even sometimes open source code repositories that potentially inform novelty decisions at the USPTO. So examination these days is sort of like finding a needle in a haystack. And you need to find the right prior art documents out of these tens, hundreds of millions of things that have been done before to try to find the specific documents that will help the expert inform their adjudication decision. So again, we call on AI to empower examiners by helping them quickly and accurately retrieve these relevant prior art documents for each case they're working on. So different government agencies will have different approaches to AI. At the USPTO, our approach is very much focused on empowering our experts to do their job.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerry. Karen, would you like to jump in?
Sure, and I'm going to take it in a little bit different direction here about government's role in the development of some of these AI technologies or AI use cases as we're discussing it. So I'm going to go a little bit in a different direction based on my previous experience at Department of Energy. And so there at Energy, that we did set up an AI office, and we have 17 national labs there. And when we were working with that, it's like, what is the right investments that government should make with private industry? So Tony's talked a little bit about how the FBI works with private industry. What we were doing was, okay, how do we do this? Look at what is a national problem. So for example, keeping the grid up and running, that would be a national problem, right? Like we're talking about different types of threats and how we use the data, but we want to make sure we have power. So one of the things that my office was responsible for was an R&D portfolio. So, talking about making the smart grid really smart, you need to have AI technology, machine learning. You have to have this knowledge. So one of the technologies that we were investing in was a smart PLC. And so a PLC is a little program controller that helps route energy. That's the easiest way to think about it locally. And the idea was it would measure oscillations. So this gets to David's point about there's so much information that the human eye just can't digest it all, right? So this is direct opposite of what Jerry was talking about. And what this smart programmable, the PLC would do was actually start measuring the oscillations. And if there is a difference in what it was expecting to get, right, that it could reroute the energy so that the power would actually stay up, and then start doing the analytics associated to why was the oscillation different, and then be able to isolate it. So what we were really looking for is if our adversaries had come in, affected things through with an implant on cybersecurity, and now it's returning information that looks like to the human eye the right information, but because it's coming in so fast, it looks to this little device as the wrong information. It would reroute, continue the power, smooth out the power, so that, me at my house, I'm still going to get my power while the rest of us are trying to figure out on the back end, and it gets isolated. What is happening in that particular area? Is it a natural malfunction, or is it actually a threat malfunction. And so that's how we were using it. And that's really going to become critical as we go forward to sustain several of these things when you're looking at supply chain risk management, when we're looking at integrating more renewables into the grid. We're going to have a way to be able to instantaneously do that analytics, because the human is not going to be able to do it as fast to maintain that power supply.
Wow, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear about your efforts there. Tony, would you like to give your response to this question as well?
Yeah, so Karen made a really good point about how so much of this is happening out in the private sector. I mean, for example, our critical infrastructure is not owned by the government. And so there has to be a lot of collaboration there in terms of how to get that to work in a future society. And AI is, of course, a big piece of that. And so I had mentioned before, the Office of the Private Sector. I mean, that's sort of part of the FBI's overall effort to, for example, bring certain types of issues to the attention of companies. Things like intellectual property theft, those kinds of issues that maybe in the past were not as much on the radar, but now with technology playing an increasingly large role in competitiveness nationally and commercially and all that, that becomes part of the picture. And also, I want to internally reflect sort of Jerry's point about our use cases are very much also along the theme of how do we enhance our human experts. So we have special agents, intelligence analysts, all sorts of personnel who function under a very well-established framework of how we do investigations. And where AI provides a lot of value internally in that respect is in helping our human experts be able to pay attention to things that are most relevant. And so to give an example of a version of that, so in 2017, we had the mass shooting incident in Las Vegas. That involved, a lot of casualties, there was a lot of evidence collected, right? Over 21,000 hours of video. That's a situation where, yeah, maybe in theory, we could have just hired tons of people and, just watched all this stuff. But with the help of AI technologies, though, that's a situation where we could, for example, get face detection to be part of our workflow, so that our human experts, instead of starting from blank slate looking at this scene from footage, can zoom right into the things where their evaluative abilities as human experts can deliver the most value. And so that way we're able to cut out a lot of the inefficiencies of, okay, where should we start looking first? And so, that's a situation where we ended up being able to tag and review all these hours of video in 10 days. And that was a situation where it was a bit more after the fact. In 2018, we had the serial bombings in Austin, Texas. This was, again, we were able to use video analytics like this, detecting faces in the footage of scenes. But this was a very sort of time-sensitive operational situation where we're trying to identify, whoever is involved before they strike again. And so in both cases, we're able to use AI to really, supercharge our human experts.
Wow, so tremendous to hear about that. Patrick, you want to jump to the next question? It's a great segue, I believe. Okay, so every single person here has talked about collaboration between the private and the public sector. And Tony, you just talked about using, facial recognition tools. Karen, you talked about this. David definitely talked about this. So in the ideal world, how does collaboration work between the public and private sector? And then, of course, this question on the screen is, how do AI use cases differ between the federal and state level? If we could just speak to this, I think it'd be really interesting for the audience. Jerry, why don't you kick it off if you don't mind? I'm curious from your perspective.
Sure thing. So that's actually one of the reasons I was most excited about this panel in particular, in that we do have a healthy mix of former federal and state folks here, because I think it's underappreciated in the whole AI for government conversation that the majority of direct services provisioned to Americans is at the state and local level. So, we often hear about, DoD AI this, of course, in my own backyard, DOC AI, all these 3-letter acronyms. But in reality, your neighbor, your next door neighbor is going to be looking towards state governments to provide the most effective, efficient, direct services. So I don't have the answer, frankly, not being from a state perspective, but I'm super curious to hear about, particularly from David, how that focus on, direct service to state and local citizens influences, their view on deploying AI versus, the federal approach which is often much more, cautious, a bit slower in the federal space, not by want of enthusiasm, but simply because there are a lot more, procedural, regulatory hurdles to cross.
Yeah, definitely. And David, I'd love for you to weigh in just a moment. Jerry, just to follow up though with what you're saying, I mean, my understanding of your background is you went from private sector to public sector. And could you just speak to, if you wouldn't mind, why are there more hurdles in the federal space? What exactly are you encountering that's different?
Sure thing. So there's a big difference between, the objectives and the incentive structures within industry and government, bottom line. Industry, particularly the, tech startup space, is all about showing, impact, showing the concrete benefits of these technologies. And oftentimes what you'll see is, people will try to, particularly in the startup world, try to fundraise millions of dollars on some flashy demo, right? And sort of the emphasis in industry is just, get to the minimum viable product that, achieves a certain outcome. And even in research, when you think about academic research in AI, a lot of the emphasis is on, beating the prior state of the art. So I've come up with this new model that's, managed to get maybe like a 0.5% improvement on this or that image recognition or language modeling benchmark. Okay, great. But it's very much oriented toward one side of the equation, which is the concrete, flashy benefits, and not so much the risks or the need to deliberate on exactly whether, when, and how to use these sorts of technologies. So that's very much a consideration on the government side of the house, both state and federal. You have to slow down a bit and think, okay, we have these capabilities. We've seen demos that purport to prove that they work, but what are the implications? What are the potential unintended consequences if we do deploy it in this or that context? Who are the people who will be better served by deploying this AI model? Who will be worse served? These are things that we really, in the USPTO, and I'm sure in other government bodies, slow down and take the time to assess before we just take a demo and push it straight to production. So it's much more of a two-sided, figure out what's going on. Sure, there's a lot of impact realizable with any given technology, but also take some time to consider the risks, any disparate impact from the technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this conversation is particularly timely given some of what we've seen with social media companies and some of the unintended consequences from recommendation algorithms and similar technology applied in the social media domain.
Yeah. So less profit motive and a greater appreciation for social and ethical and compliance issues. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure we're all very happy for it. David, do you want to talk about private public sector collaboration and comparisons?
Yeah, I think outside of the Department of Defense, I think the biggest difference in use cases is just one of scale. I mean, the federal government is a lot bigger, has a lot more data, and also has a lot more ability to invest. And that's why you're seeing a lot more activity, I think, at the federal level than at the state, but the states are jumping in, especially the bigger states. After we started our Center of Excellence, New York State and Texas and California, they all kicked off AI Centers of Excellence, and they're, all of those states are like, a small nation, right? I mean, that's the size they're dealing with. And we have a lot of use cases that are similar to Karen's, I think, where we need to leverage edge AI, and we also use a lot of streaming data. So we have partnered with local governments as well. We've pulled in a couple of members of our Center of Excellence from cities and from our Smart Cities organization, because you deal with a lot of streaming data. And when you're dealing with that kind of data, the ability to, in certain use cases, the ability to analyze and respond to it in near real time becomes important, whether it's traffic, real-time traffic issues. We've connected all of our traffic lights, and we're able to stream that data and analyze it and improve the way that we manage our traffic lights, so people don't have to stop as often. And we've reduced that from 48% stops down to 26% stops. And that reduction of traffic stops helps in a lot of ways. It reduces air pollution, and we have sensor networks that monitor air quality. And so we're pulling in that data and analyzing it in near real time as well. And other kinds of sensor networks that are related to energy, we have at the state level as well. To me, that's one of the most interesting use cases, is how we manage streaming data associated with our fast growing Internet of Things. Whether it's, we have a lot of cameras that monitor our roadways, and we can respond to things like Amber Alerts more quickly because of AI. So there's a lot of those kinds of applications. We have similar applications to Tony at the FBI with our Department of Public Safety, where we need to use image recognition in the criminal justice area. Again, that's an area where privacy issues are important, and so you need to develop a governance process that ensures that you govern those processes effectively. But we have the similar relationship with the local governments that the federal government has to us, and the more we can work together on this, I think the better. We're just getting involved with something called the National Science Data Fabric Initiative. The federal government gave a grant, and University of Utah was part of that grant, and so I look forward to seeing how we can develop a data fabric that more effectively supports some of these AI use cases that may be shared between us and the federal government.
Must be excellent. Thank you very much, David. Karen, what are your thoughts on this topic?
So when we start looking at use cases, I think you've hit on several of these, but when we talk about public-private partnership, I think it is going to depend on exactly what you're looking at. So for example, we've already heard things about smart cities, right? And so that local utility, when you start getting into a smart city, part of that is owned by the local government, part of that is owned by private sector, but it needs to be informed by information that's going to come from the state level and from the federal level, right, as it rolls up. So something as easy as one of the initiatives that I worked on was called recreation.gov. And the whole idea, and this is a perfect use case for, AI, is I'm going out and I'm going to drive cross country, and I want to make reservations at different parks along the way. I mean, that sounds like a reasonable request, right? And you should be able to get the data, and it sounds like you should be able to do that. When we started looking at that from a federal government perspective, because we own the national parks, there's a certain set of things, and we're like, oh yeah, you could streamline it all, except then you start realizing that it's a revenue stream for a local government. It's a revenue stream for the state. And if the federal government is going to start offering things free, now we're affecting what the revenue streams are. So that's the unintended consequences of why the partnership is really important, because you have to know what the impact is going to be on the businesses that you could potentially affect. When we start getting into things like smart cities, new technologies, how these things get implemented, and Jerry hit on this about private sector versus public sector. I've had the opportunity to be involved in venture capital as well. I think what is happening, and you're seeing some of this convergence as well, and AI is bringing it to light, again, is if I don't think about some of these factors up front when I'm engineering the solution, it is either not going to be able to get deployed. So that's great. You're going to have this great little demo that you're going to be able to show, and you might get first or second round funding, but it's not going to be applicable because of everything else. Like it can't go into, a critical infrastructure. It can't go into a state because of an issue. And so I'm finding that companies now are reaching out more to understand what those potential risks are. Like, I mean, I sat down and talked to a company that had robots that was going to mine underground, which, like, this sounds great, right? Because you're not going to do strip mining. You're not going to do any of these things, real small little environmental impact. It's going to go underground, and then it's going to start processing things. And I said, how much technology is actually embedded in that? And he went through all these things, and I said, oh, great. And then it's going to talk to a network, so it's network enabled. And they said, yeah. I said, oh boy, I just kind of went like, oh boy. And he goes, what? And I kind of went through all the different potential threat vectors, and he goes, and that's why we're talking to you, because like you want it deployed, right, for all the right reasons, but you don't want to end up on the front page of the Washington Post or in front of a congressional hearing because you didn't necessarily think of all the threat vectors that could affect your investment. So there is a lot of that convergence, and I'm sure, Tony, you would have a lot to add to that as well.
Yes, thanks, Karen. Kind of to echo that and some earlier points, sort of in a general sense, there's like different roles, right, that the public sphere and the private sector play. And so even though you have sometimes, so to maybe draw an analogy a little bit for the audience, I mean, say you're, a grad student, or, you're just at home and as a hobby, you want to do a Kaggle competition, right? Well, at home, you can just download whatever, you can use whatever algorithm, the latest bleeding edge thing. And as long as it gets you a good spot on the leaderboard, then that's good, right? And so a lot of how private sector functions, yeah, there'll be some sort of fact-based metric like that they want to improve, accuracy, precision score, and whatever. And there's absolutely a place for that, sort of the advancement of the pure technology. And then on the other side, for us in the public sphere, we have, an explicit legal responsibility to be accountable to the public. We're using taxpayer money. There's all these, we have a lot more obligations explicitly to society. And so that's good. So then that forces us to really think about a lot of these facets of responsible AI use. Is this model being trained on data that maybe is biased against, a segment of the population or something? Are there privacy or constitutional concerns with how these things are trained? We can't just, look at this black box and say, well, I don't know, it seems to output, the highest percent accuracy or whatever. We care about explainability and interpretability, because we can't just, we have to justify what we're doing. We have to have the trust of the American public. And these are all considerations that, some of them are technical, some of them are more sort of questions for society to decide, right? But we are at least pushing that, yes, these are real questions, whether or not, the private sector has decided to ask them yet. And so in that sense, we're almost kind of exploring and pushing the frontier in different directions. And that's why when we have a partnership, then we're better able to kind of take advantage of the kind of knowledge and sort of develop best practices across both sides.
Excellent.
And just to add one final point on that, I think, I'm sure many, if not all folks here share this experience. Anytime you sit down with a industry presenter or just industry entity for any sort of conversation, and it's obvious that they've, quote unquote, done their homework, so to speak, it makes future interactions so much better. So, the best conversations we've had at the patent office with industry folks who want to, build technology to solve patent problems has always been, when they've clearly done their homework, when they've clearly demonstrated an understanding of, the issues that we face each and every day. Oftentimes, sometimes, I won't say oftentimes, but sometimes they'll even be able to cite to relevant sections of Title 35 of the US Code. That's when this is someone and this is a group to pay attention to. So I very much want to say for any of the industry participants on the call, from the government side, we very much value when you as industry collaborators just sit down and take the time to understand some of these specific considerations that go into how we in the government need to work with and deploy these new technologies.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerry, and everyone. Patricia, let's jump to the next question. Okay, great. So this is super relevant. Everyone's talked about challenges, especially social, ethical, that the government needs to take seriously. I would also be interested in hearing more about pragmatic and practical challenges that everyone's facing. But the question here is, what challenges or difficulties do you see or anticipate when it comes to the adoption of AI-driven technology? Karen, would you mind kicking this one off?
Sure. And I'm going to go again in a different direction a little bit so that my panelists can jump in here. When we were looking at this at DHS, one of the major concerns we have, and I think, Tony, you hit on this a little bit, is actually the source of the algorithm itself. And really looking at supply chain issues associated with the algorithm and then the veracity of that algorithm. Because if we're going to rely on results using our own data sources internally, this really starts getting down to even to the point where like we are looking at chips and foundries of the chips, and you hear us always talking about that kind of stuff. Supply chain as it relates to this, and what you see the government moving toward is the software build of materials, that is going to be huge when we start looking at how we're going to pick up different algorithms, how we're going to use the technologies. And the federal government's really moving toward this software build of materials now so that we can really understand what we're deploying. So it's one thing to go, whoo, this is really cool, but what we really have to be able to do is have reliability and integrity of the results that get back to us, because our decision makers are relying on those results. So we were really, and I see everyone is continuing to really look at this, is the underlying piece of the algorithm itself and the veracity of that. I think that's going to be the practical implications of what we have that will then, us looking at the adoption of AI and those technologies going forward.
Gotcha. Really interesting to hear. Karen, so just to ask a follow-up question, I mean, do you feel that there is a role for a black box model, let's say, anywhere in the federal government, if you can't really have the explainability factor, or would you say that really has no place anywhere in government?
Okay, so if I was still in charge, there would be no black box. Okay, there just really wouldn't be, because we see different things, and the way that the threat landscape is changing now, it is really important to be able to see inside the black box. And so, like I said, if I was in charge, there would be no black box. And I can tell based on the way this administration is laying out its policies and its executive orders, like you will see that the black box disappear. I mean, the foundation is there for it to go away.
Great. Anyone else want to jump in on this? I think probably everyone has really neat perspective to share.
I just had a few really quick ones. And one was the same as Karen's, and that was really ensuring the quality of algorithms. Also avoiding over-regulation. I think government, often our legislators want to regulate everything without fully understanding what the regulations do. The next one was ensuring data quality, and the last one is working together to build a data fabric to support more advanced capabilities. I think those are 4 challenges that are important with where we're at today.
Each of which you could write a book about, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you so much, David. Tony, Jerry, would you like to jump in? We have 4 minutes left. Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so to add briefly to Karen's point, yeah, a black box, there's philosophical problems in terms of we need explainability, interpretability in order, to have the trust of our audiences. But there's also practical issues as well, because a lot of the time our use cases are going to be different than what might be commercially encountered. So, for example, if we have data that's collected from, a body-worn microphone or some other kind of scenario where now the audio data we're talking about is not something that really has much of an analog to the usual models that are built in the private sector. Now, if that's a black box, that's going to probably not work and have the same accuracy as expected. And if it's a black box, then there's basically nothing we can do about it. And so that's also a logistical problem on top of the philosophical issues.
Jerry?
Sure. So I'll join the chorus that is skeptical of black boxes here, and I think just to add on to the conversation, one super big practical question that comes up when we think about model transparency, explainability of a model is really, at the end of the day, who has control and or ownership over a model, right? So the majority of federal IT is built by vendors or contractors rather than in-house. So when we do acquire, procure, commission AI technologies from non-government entities, does the government agency get control and ownership over the model, or is it does it remain the intellectual property of the vendor or contractor? And this has huge implications for the suitability of a technology, an algorithm, a system, what have you, to be viable over the long haul for use in a government agency, right? This gets into questions of vendor lock-in, but also just gets into questions of is it even a feasible regime to need to depend on one singular private entity service provider to answer fundamental questions on explainability, to inquire as to why a certain decision was made by an AI on a case that might be really high stakes at the individual level, right? Having the ownership on the government side, we might not be able to fully elucidate that answer, but we can at least do our best. Having command and control on the vendor or contractor side, we might not even be able to make our best effort to answer those questions for our customers, for our stakeholders. So I think it's a very underlooked issue, I think, often, but at the end of the day, who owns the AI models that we're paying for and AI systems that we're paying for is just so crucial to these conversations about transparency, about black boxes, so on and so forth.
Definitely. Well, we are out of time. That was a super enlightening conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'll turn it back over to Patrika, assuming she is still with us. Hey, Patrika.
Hey, thank you all so much. This has been incredible. And a special thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And thank you, Dan, for moderating and keeping us on track. A big virtual round of applause to all of you for your wonderful insights today.
Woo-hoo!
That was awesome. For the audience, we thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed this and gotten just as much out of this as we have. And we look forward to seeing you at future AI4 events. So keep an eye on your email for upcoming events and things that you can participate in. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.
Bye, everyone.